the most common idiom for sin in, the bulk of the Old Testament is going to be sin as a burden that the individual must bear. Now, people are often surprised when I tell them that because this idiom isn't reflected frequently in translation. But the Hebrew term for one of the most common Hebrew words for sin, avon, if you take a look at my book, I counted the number of occurrences of this verb in the Hebrew Bible, some almost 130, let's say. But of the 130 occurrences of this verb, I mean, noun, I'm sorry, for sin, what are the verbs associated with it? Nasa, which means to bear or to bear away, is 108 times. So it's by far and away the most common idiom, but people don't realize this because it's translated, we might want to say more colorlessly, almost invariably in the Hebrew Bible as simply to forgive sin or to become guilty. But it really means, the idiom means to be guilty means to carry sin as a burden on your shoulder. I
Which
think of, individuals in New Yorker cartoons who, are undergoing some, tragic circumstance. You'll see their shoulders hunched over, and they're walking with their head down. They're clearly burdened. That's the image the Bible is thinking of. When we do things wrong, we are
yeah.
burdened by
Yeah, so
them.
the idea is sort of this natural consequence. I think what in Deuteronomy, I remember maybe chapter 28, I can't forget. I can't remember rather. The natural consequence of wrongdoing is bad stuff will happen to you.
Yeah, of
So
course.
it's a burden that you have to carry now because you committed the sin.
That's right. And then forgiveness it actually uses the same verb, but here, not in the sense of bear or carry, but to be borne away. If someone forgives you, they bear away the burden that's on your back. And so we can see this image in the New Testament too, the Lamb of God who bears away the sin. That's very much sin conceived of as a burden. And it's an image that comes from Leviticus 16, you might want to say the model of forgiveness in the Old Testament, the Day of Atonement, the day in which sins are forgiven. And what happens in that story? Well, the sins are offloaded as a burden
Mm-hmm.
onto an animal known as the scapegoat, and that animal then carries those sins away into the desert, where they then disappear forever. So
Can we speak about that? I mean, this obviously people recognize that phrase scapegoat. I know there's also important sort of academic observations to be made about the larger concept, but just that's a bit in Leviticus. So we're talking about the Pentateuch and the narrative of the Israelites, on their way from Egypt, 40 years wandering in the desert towards the promised land. So it's set in a pre-temple context, right, where they're in the desert. But then it also establishes a ritual that really did it actually take place once the temple is built and there's a cult in Jerusalem with the goat and everything.
So the two ways to answer that. I mean, according to the fictive history of the Bible, we might want to say what the Bible presents as historical reality. Of course, it occurred. It does occur in Leviticus 16 while Israel is wandering in the desert, but it occurs in the context of the uh, tabernacle cult, the worship that happens at the tabernacle, which is simply a forerunner of the worship that will occur in the Jerusalem temple. And of course, the city of Jerusalem, as anyone knows who's visited there, sits within a desert. So an animal being loaded with the sins, in front of the temple and being sent off into the Judean wilderness is an animal that will disappear, no different than the animal from, Israelite wanderings in the Sinai. There's not, really a big difference there. So yes,
It's
according to
different from a sacrifice. When you slaughter an animal and you burn its flesh, you're giving something to God, right? The scapegoat ritual of Leviticus 16 is just getting rid of your sins, sending them away.
correct,
Okay.
correct.
I just, yeah, I mean, eventually then it becomes obsolete, that ritual, and the temple is, among other things, for sacrifice.
One of when I've taught this before in class, one of my favorite images of sin as a burden. Have you ever seen the movie The Mission?
Yeah, a long time ago. Yeah, but I've
Oh,
seen
it's about the Jesuit
De Niro.
mission
Was De Niro in it?
in Peru. I can't remember the actors. I'm not very good on that stuff.
Okay.
But the man who is the chief offender, who is the colonialist who abuses the native Peruvians to really just a terrible end, wants to make amends for what he's done, and so the priest then, as a penance, makes him carry all of the weapons he used to abuse these native Peruvians, and he climbs up an enormous cliff, a waterfall, barely can do it. It's a huge amount of weight on his back, and he appears then before the individuals he's abused. And of course, when they see him, they want to kill him, but the priest is there and tells them that he's appealing for forgiveness. And so, in a beautiful scene, they cut the rope that has all of those weapons on his back
Mm.
and frees him from his burden. And they're the only ones that really can forgive him. The priest can pronounce forgiveness, but he didn't sin against the priest. His sins were against, these
Yeah.
native, Latin Americans.
Yes.
And it's their right to offer forgiveness, and they do so by cutting off the burden that he's carried up the mountain. So that's very much the image that I think circulates in First Temple Hebrew of sinning, bearing the results of your sins on your back, and God or the human being you've offended, they forgive you by unloading you of that burden.
It's a beautiful image. So then what happens when you get to Daniel, for example, just to use that book as an example, a later book, I think it's actually set in the exile, but presumably, I actually don't know, I'm kind of guessing, presumably written even later, that, you have this other metaphor of debt and transaction that sort of takes over. Why does that change?
So, Daniel is in part a good example. It has the notion certainly of charitable actions, paying down a debt, redeeming one's sins. It doesn't have sin as a debt explicitly, however, as you can get there, but it's a little bit more contrived. The better book for looking at this would be Isaiah 40, for example,
Okay.
where the iniquities that Israel has committed and suffered from have been, paid off, is the idiom used in Isaiah 40. And that's clearly the notion that their punishments, as it were, generated a kind of spiritual coinage, which not only paid down, but eliminated the debts that they accrued leading up to the exile. So that's the kind of, the gold standard for seeing
And the
this
idea in Isaiah 40 is the suffering of the Israelites by going into exile and living in exile,
right,
and the humiliation and oppression they
right.
experienced in exile.
Yeah, and they suffered sufficiently, kind of like David again being expelled from the city of Jerusalem. They not only suffered, they accepted their punishment as the just due for what they've done. And then this becomes then, ironically, the means by which they can assure their return.
So
Goes back to the story of Adam
it's
and
like,
Eve.
sorry, I keep interrupting you, but it's like when someone says, "Oh, he's done his time,
Yeah, that would be
done
that
his
would
time in prison."
right. He served his time, but in this instance, it's not purely serving time as though it were a kind of karmic principle that there was a kind of ledger book that said you owe this and you're going to pay it come hell or high water. Forgiveness really requires, and here we got to go back to David, that the individual acknowledges the deep sense of wrongdoing, and that the punishment that then is endured willingly, consciously, and in a rehabilitative fashion.
Yeah, so someone
But
can come
it's
out of
not
prison, just as bad as when he went in, and
right. That's not going to work. It's not just going out to the woodshed and receiving your lashes, as it were, but rather, it's if we're going to go back to the example I used earlier of the husband who had been a spousal abuser. He makes amends, repairs his life, but his spouse still won't have him back. I mean, part of his penance is accepting that, right? Accepting the gravity of what he's done. Perhaps accepting the penalty is like an aide memoir to how far he had fallen, and his appeal for divine grace then will be an unending aspect of his human life. I remember, let's even be more specific in wake of the clerical abuse problem, which broke when I was in Boston in the late 90s. Many people were scandalized that then Cardinal Law of Boston, though he was removed from his position as bishop, he was awarded a kind of sinecure in Rome. I think he was serving at, St. Mary Major. People thought, well, that's not, a penance for what he's done. What he should have done is gone to a monastery
Yeah.
and served a life of prayer and almsgiving to the poor. And again, not in some, ledger book fashion, but rather, this is the
Time
kind
to
of
reflect and repent. Yeah.
right. And you need to ponder, with the gravity the sins you committed, what you've done wrong, and amend your life.
There, there's a line, maybe in the Psalms, maybe not. We sat down by the waters of
Oh yeah,
Babylon.
it's Psalm 137. Yeah.
Is that connected to this kind of notion?
Well, yeah. I mean, actually, in the prayers of Qumran, it's actually a beautiful prayer in Leviticus 26, talks about the penalties that God is going to inflict on Israel on the basis of their violation of the covenant, and of course that's understood to then have taken effect with the exile. In the prayers of the Covenanters at Qumran, they utilize that very passage from Leviticus, but turn it around, that we happily take on the cost of what we've done